The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had left a trail of destruction in his wake, a trail that led to the discovery of his first victim's body in a shallow grave, her lifeless eyes staring back at the world that had failed her. The townsfolk, once content with their lives, now found themselves living in a shadow cast by the actions of one man whose name had become synonymous with terror. The police, initially skeptical of the young woman's claims, were soon forced to confront the evidence that pointed directly to Watts. The investigation that followed was a grueling process, a journey through the darkest corners of human nature, as the police pieced together the fragments of a life destroyed by a man who had no regard for the sanctity of human life. The first clues came from Watts's own home, a seemingly ordinary house on the outskirts of the small town. Inside, the police discovered a hidden room, its walls adorned with disturbing paraphernalia and the remnants of his victim's belongings. It was a shrine to his darkness, a testament to the sickening things he had done. The room was filled with photographs of women, some alive, others in their coffins, a sickening juxtaposition that spoke volumes about the man who called it home. The young woman who had first come forward, a survivor of Watts's grasp, was a fragile being who had been through hell and back. Her testimony was harrowing, filled with details of the man's cruel and relentless pursuit. She described how he had drugged and raped her, how he had taken her against her will, and how he had left her for dead. Her words, combined with the physical evidence found at the scene of her attack, painted a picture of a predator who had slipped through the cracks of society. As the investigation deepened, more victims emerged. Each one had a story of their own, each one had a face, and each one had been stolen from the world by the hands of Christopher Lee Watts. The authorities were faced with the grim task of piecing together the lives of these women, lives that had been cut short by a man who seemed to derive satisfaction from their suffering. The psychological evidence was equally disturbing. Watts's own writings and journal entries revealed a mind twisted and twisted further by his own depravity. He spoke of his desire to control and possess, to mold his victims into the lifeless objects he craved. His words were a chilling testament to the depths of his madness, a reflection of a soul lost to the darkness that had consumed him. The police were relentless in their pursuit, determined to bring justice to the women whose lives had been stolen. They sifted through the evidence, examining every detail, every piece of clothing, every bit of DNA. They worked tirelessly, their determination fueled by the knowledge that they were chasing a monster that had already claimed the lives of too many innocent souls. As the investigation unfolded, more secrets were unearthed, more lies were exposed, and more darkness was revealed. Watts's web of deceit was vast, his reach far and wide. He had preyed on the most vulnerable among them, preying on those who trusted him, those who saw him as a friend or a confidant. He had manipulated and exploited, creating a facade of normalcy that allowed him to continue his heinous acts undetected for far too long. The townspeople were in shock, their lives turned upside down by the revelations. They had lived in fear, knowing that the monster who lived among them was just one step away from striking again. The community was shattered, its once close-knit bonds frayed by the terror that had spread through their midst. They had to come together to support one another, to heal, to find strength in the face of such horror. The trial that followed was a spectacle, a testament to the human capacity for both good and evil. Watts, with his chilling smirk and cold eyes, seemed to revel in the attention he received. He was a performer, a master of manipulation, and he played his part to perfection. But for the families of his victims, the trial was a necessary step towards closure, a chance to see justice served, however late it may come. As the evidence against him mounted, the jury was left with little doubt about the man they were convicting. Watts was found guilty of multiple counts of murder, his sentence handed down with a sense of justice finally being served. The townspeople, while relieved, were still in the process of healing, their lives irrevocably changed by the man who had once walked among them. The story of Christopher Lee Watts and the Watts family murders serves as a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk within even the most seemingly normal of individuals. It is a story of pain, of loss, and of the relentless pursuit of justice. It is a story that will forever be etched in the hearts and minds of those who knew the victims, and it is a story that will continue to resonate with those who hear it, a chilling reminder of the fragility of human life and the importance of never taking it for granted. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had left a trail of destruction in his wake, a trail that led to the discovery of his first victim's body in a shallow grave, her lifeless eyes staring back at the world that had failed her. The townsfolk, once content with their lives, now found themselves living in a shadow cast by the actions of one man whose name had become synonymous with terror. The police, initially skeptical of the young woman's claims, were soon forced to confront the evidence that pointed directly to Watts. The investigation that followed was a grueling process, a journey through the darkest corners of human nature, as the police pieced together the fragments of a life destroyed by a man who had no regard for the sanctity of human life. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had been a seemingly normal man, a husband and father, a man who had a job, a home, and a seemingly happy life. But beneath the surface, a dark and twisted mind lurked, a mind that had been corrupted by a deep-seated desire for control and power. The police had to sift through a mountain of lies and manipulation to uncover the truth. Watts had been using his charm and charisma to lure women into his home, promising them love and protection, only to lock them away in his basement, where they became his prey. The police discovered a series of hidden rooms, each one a testament to the depravity that had been hidden behind a seemingly perfect facade. They found personal items, photographs, and even a makeshift shrine dedicated to Watts' collection of victims. As the investigation deepened, the police uncovered a pattern of behavior that was both chilling and methodical. Watts had been targeting women who were vulnerable, those who were either alone or in difficult situations. He had used his position as a father and a husband to gain their trust, only to betray them in the most heinous ways. The psychological evidence was just as disturbing as the physical evidence. Watts had kept detailed diaries, filled with his thoughts, his desires, and his justifications for his actions. It was clear that he had been planning his crimes for years, even decades, and that he had been collecting his victims with a meticulousness that was almost clinical. The townsfolk were shocked to learn that the man they had known and trusted had been living such a dark existence. They were haunted by the thought that they had been so close to the monster, and yet had never seen the signs. The police had to work tirelessly to piece together the timeline of events, to understand how Watts had been able to operate for so long without being caught. They had to interview friends, family, and coworkers, all of whom had seen Watts at his best and at his worst, and had failed to recognize the monster that lay beneath the surface. As the investigation progressed, more victims came forward, each one with a story that was almost identical to the first. They had all been lured by Watts' promise of love and protection, only to find themselves trapped and terrified. The police had to confront the fact that Watts had been a predator, a man who had been preying on the innocent for years. They had to grapple with the idea that he had been capable of such monstrous acts, and that he had been able to evade capture for so long. The psychological toll on the investigators was immense. They had to confront the darkest aspects of human nature, to see the depths to which a person could sink. They had to process the evidence, to understand the mind of a killer, and to try to find a way to bring him to justice. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling, a testament to the evil that could exist within a human being. The trial that followed was a spectacle, a court of public opinion that was as fascinated by Watts as it was appalled by him. The defense tried to paint him as a victim of his own twisted mind, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury had no doubt that Watts was guilty, and he was sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. The townsfolk, who had once lived in fear of the shadow cast by Watts, now found some solace in the fact that he would never be able to harm another person again. But the scars left by Watts' actions were deep and lasting. The community had to come together to heal, to find a way to move forward after such a traumatic event. They had to confront the fact that their lives had been forever changed by the actions of one man, and that they would have to carry that burden for the rest of their days. The police, who had worked tirelessly to bring Watts to justice, had to grapple with the fact that they had been unable to save the women who had fallen victim to his twisted desires. The story of Christopher Lee Watts and the Watts family murders would be one that would be remembered for years to come, a cautionary tale of the darkness that can exist within the human soul. It would serve as a reminder of the importance of trust, of the need to be vigilant, and of the consequences that can come from allowing a monster to walk among us. The evidence, both physical and psychological, had painted a picture of a man who was capable of unspeakable acts, and the community would never forget the horror that had been unleashed upon them. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had left a trail of destruction in his wake, a trail that led to the discovery of his first victim's body in a shallow grave, her lifeless eyes staring back at the world that had failed her. The townsfolk, once content with their lives, now found themselves living in a shadow cast by the actions of one man whose name had become synonymous with terror. The police, initially skeptical of the young woman's claims, were soon forced to confront the evidence that pointed directly to Watts. The investigation that followed was a grueling process, a journey through the darkest corners of human nature, as the police pieced together the fragments of a life destroyed by a man who had no regard for the sanctity of human life. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had been a respected member of the community, a father, a husband, a seemingly ordinary man. But beneath the surface, he was a monster, a predator who had preyed upon the most vulnerable members of his own family. As the investigation deepened, more bodies were found, each one more macabre than the last. The victims were young, female, and had all been reported missing under suspicious circumstances. The police, now faced with a serial killer on their hands, worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. They interviewed witnesses, combed through surveillance footage, and analyzed every piece of evidence they could get their hands on. But Watts was a master of manipulation and deception, leaving behind no clear-cut clues that would lead them to his doorstep. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Watts continued to deny any wrongdoing. He claimed he was innocent, that the accusations were all part of a witch hunt designed to frame him. But the police were determined to uncover the truth, and they knew that Watts was not just a serial killer. He was a manipulator, a mastermind who had woven a web of lies and deceit around himself. The psychological profile of Watts painted a picture of a man who was cunning, intelligent, and deeply disturbed. He had a history of violence, dating back to his childhood, where he had been subjected to physical and emotional abuse. This trauma had left him with a twisted sense of morality, a belief that he was above the law and that his desires were justified. His victims, young and vulnerable, were nothing more than pawns in his twisted game. As the investigation continued, the police uncovered a pattern in Watts' behavior. He had a method to his madness, a ritual that he followed whenever he killed. He would lure his victims to a remote location, often a secluded area he had scouted out beforehand. Once there, he would use a combination of threats and manipulation to subdue them, ensuring that they were completely at his mercy. He would then kill them, often in a brutal and sadistic manner, and bury their bodies in a location that would be difficult to find. The psychological profile revealed that Watts had a deep-seated need for control, a need that drove him to take lives. He thrived on the power he exerted over his victims, the fear he instilled in them before their final moments. The more he killed, the more he felt a sense of power, a sense of invincibility that he believed gave him the right to do as he pleased. The townsfolk, once living in the shadow of their killer, were now living in fear. They had seen the destruction Watts had wrought on their community, and they knew that he was still out there, possibly watching, waiting for his next opportunity. The police, however, were relentless in their pursuit. They knew that they had to catch Watts before he could harm anyone else, before he could claim another life. As the investigation continued, the police focused on Watts' behavior, his patterns, and his connections. They looked at his friends, his family, and even his colleagues, searching for any sign that would lead them to his true identity. They knew that Watts had to have had someone who knew him well, someone who could provide the missing pieces of the puzzle. It was during one of these interviews that the breakthrough came. A close friend of Watts revealed that he had noticed strange behavior from his colleague, behavior that was out of character and disturbing. He had mentioned to his wife that Watts seemed to be fixated on young women, that he often spoke about them in a way that was both strange and unsettling. The police, aware of this new information, began to focus their efforts on Watts' connections with young women. They discovered that he had been involved in a number of online forums where he discussed his desires and his fantasies. He had even gone so far as to create fake profiles, using them to entice young women into dangerous situations. As the evidence mounted, the police felt confident that they were closing in on Watts. They knew that they had to act quickly before he could strike again. They set up a sting operation, using a young woman as bait to lure Watts out of hiding. The plan was simple but effective. They would wait for him to make his move, and then they would pounce. The day of the sting arrived, and the police were on high alert. They had their eyes on Watts, watching his every move. They knew that he was unpredictable, that he could be violent at a moment's notice. But they were prepared, ready to bring him to justice. As the young woman, an undercover police officer, met with Watts at the predetermined location, the tension was palpable. Watts was as cunning as ever, trying to ascertain her true intentions. But the police, with their years of experience and their unwavering determination, were not about to let him slip through their fingers. The encounter was brief but intense. Watts tried to manipulate the situation, to convince the young woman that he was innocent. But she was not fooled, and she knew that she had to keep her cool. She played along, giving Watts the opportunity to make his move. As he reached for his gun, the police moved in, surrounding him. Watts, realizing that his time was up, tried to fight back, but it was too late. The police, with their training and their resolve, subdued him without incident. Watts was taken into custody, his reign of terror finally coming to an end. The townsfolk, who had lived in fear for so long, breathed a collective sigh of relief. They knew that their lives would never be the same, that the shadow cast by Watts would never completely disappear. But they also knew that justice had been served, that their community had been protected from a monster. The trial that followed was a spectacle, a showcase of the evidence that had been gathered over the course of the investigation. Watts was found guilty of multiple counts of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His victims, their families, and the community at large were relieved that he would never again be a threat to anyone. But the aftermath of the Watts family murders left a lasting scar on the community. It was a reminder of the darkness that can exist within even the most seemingly ordinary individuals. The townsfolk, while grateful for the justice that had been served, were also left with a sense of loss, a loss of innocence, a loss of trust in the world around them. The police, on the other hand, were haunted by the case. They had seen the worst of human nature, and they knew that they had to continue their work to protect the innocent and to bring those who had committed such heinous acts to justice. The Watts family murders had been a wake-up call, a stark reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the years passed, the memory of Watts and his victims remained vivid in the minds of the townsfolk. They visited the graves of the young women who had lost their lives, leaving flowers and notes in their honor. They spoke of the tragedy, of the lessons learned, and of the hope that such a tragedy would never happen again. But the reality was that it could happen again, that there were still monsters out there, waiting for their moment to strike. The police, the community, and the families of the victims had to remain vigilant, to remember the darkness that had once lived among them, and to work together to ensure that it would never return. The story of Christopher Lee Watts and the Watts family murders would forever serve as a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of never taking it for granted. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had left a trail of destruction in his wake, a trail that led to the discovery of his first victim's body in a shallow grave, her lifeless eyes staring back at the world that had failed her. The townsfolk, once content with their lives, now found themselves living in a shadow cast by the actions of one man whose name had become synonymous with terror. The police, initially skeptical of the young woman's claims, were soon forced to confront the evidence that pointed directly to Watts. The investigation that followed was a grueling process, a journey through the darkest corners of human nature, as the police pieced together the fragments of a life destroyed by a man who had no regard for the sanctity of human life. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had been a man of many faces, a chameleon who could blend into any crowd, but now his true colors were revealed in the stark contrast between his peaceful demeanor and the heinous acts he committed. As the investigation deepened, the police uncovered a pattern of behavior that was as disturbing as it was methodical. Watts had been luring women with promises of love and a better life, only to trap them in a cycle of abuse and ultimately end their lives. The bodies of his victims began to pile up, each one more shocking than the last, as the authorities tried to piece together the puzzle of this twisted mind. The psychological profile of Watts was a chilling study in the depths of human depravity. He was a master manipulator, a man who could make his victims believe they were in a loving relationship, while all the while planning their demise. His victims were often young and vulnerable, women who had no idea that the man they trusted was a monster waiting to strike. The physical evidence was equally harrowing. Autopsies revealed signs of extreme violence and torture, as if Watts had taken pleasure in the pain of his victims. His home, once a place of warmth and comfort, was now a scene of horror, filled with the remnants of his crimes. Photos, letters, and other personal items suggested a man who was capable of extreme emotional manipulation, using love as a tool to ensnare his prey. The police, determined to bring Watts to justice, worked tirelessly to gather every piece of evidence that could tie him to his victims. They were relentless in their pursuit, driven by the knowledge that they were not just chasing a killer, but also trying to prevent him from striking again. The public was on edge, the community in shock, as the truth of Watts' crimes slowly came to light. The trial that followed was a spectacle, a battle of wits between the prosecution and the defense, with the fate of many hanging in the balance. Watts, a man who had always presented himself as a caring and devoted husband, now stood accused of the most heinous crimes imaginable. The courtroom was filled with the echoes of his victims' cries for help, as the jury was forced to confront the horror of Watts' actions. The jury eventually returned a guilty verdict, sending Watts to prison for the rest of his life. The victims' families, though grateful for the justice, were left to grapple with the pain and loss that Watts had caused. They found solace in the fact that their loved ones had not died in vain, that their suffering had brought about a measure of closure and a warning to others. The story of Christopher Lee Watts was a stark reminder of the depths to which a human being can sink when driven by a dark and twisted psyche. It was a tale of destruction and redemption, of the courage of those who fought to bring a monster to justice, and of the enduring power of human resilience in the face of unimaginable horror. As the world moved on from the Watts family murders, the scars left behind would never fully heal, but the memory of the victims would forever remain a testament to the fragility of life and the importance of never taking it for granted. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had left a trail of destruction in his wake, a trail that led to the discovery of his first victim's body in a shallow grave, her lifeless eyes staring back at the world that had failed her. The townsfolk, once content with their lives, now found themselves living in a a shadow cast by the actions of one man whose name had become synonymous with terror. The police, initially skeptical of the young woman's claims, were soon forced to confront the evidence that pointed directly to Watts. The investigation that followed was a grueling process, a journey through the darkest corners of human nature, as the police pieced together the fragments of a life destroyed by a man who had no regard for the sanctity of human life. The evidence against Watts was overwhelming. His fingerprints were found at the scene of the crime, and DNA tests confirmed that he was the one who had taken the young woman's life. But it was the psychological evidence that truly disturbed the investigators. Watts had a history of violence, a history that had been ignored or overlooked by those who knew him. He had been arrested for domestic abuse and had even been charged with attempted murder, but he had always been able to charm his way out of trouble. As the investigation deepened, the police discovered that Watts had been involved in more than one murder. He had been a predator for years, preying on vulnerable women who had trusted him. The list of his victims grew longer, each one a tragic testament to his lack of humanity. The police had to sift through mountains of evidence, from the smallest piece of fiber to the largest piece of furniture, all in an effort to piece together the truth. The psychological profile of Watts was equally disturbing. He was a narcissist, a man who believed he was above the law and who saw himself as the master of his own destiny. He had a deep-seated need for control, a need that drove him to manipulate and dominate those around him. His victims were not just prey, they were tools to satisfy his twisted desires. As the investigation progressed, the police uncovered a pattern. Watts had a method to his madness. He would find his victims, often through online dating sites or social media, and then he would isolate them, convincing them that they were in a loving relationship. Once he had their trust, he would take them to his home, where he would lock them up and subject them to unimaginable horrors. The police had to be careful in their approach, for Watts was a cunning and intelligent man. He had made sure to cover his tracks, but the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. They had to be thorough, to ensure that they had all the pieces of the puzzle before they moved forward. The trial that followed was a spectacle, a clash of good versus evil. Watts stood in the dock, a man who had shown no remorse for his actions. He was a monster, a man who had taken the lives of his victims and then tried to justify his behavior. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, from the DNA tests to the psychological profiles, all of which painted a picture of a man who was a danger to society. The jury, after days of deliberation, found Watts guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison, a sentence that did little to bring peace to the families of his victims. They had lost loved ones, and the justice system had failed them. But the trial had brought closure to the town, a closure that was long overdue. The story of Christopher Lee Watts was a stark reminder of the darkness that can exist within the human soul. It was a story that would be told for years to come, a story that would serve as a cautionary tale to those who might think they could get away with murder. For Watts, his reign of terror had ended, but the pain and suffering he had caused would never be forgotten. The town would heal, but it would never be the same. The shadow cast by Watts would remain, a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of never taking it for granted. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had left a trail of destruction in his wake, a trail that led to the discovery of his first victim's body in a shallow grave, her lifeless eyes staring back at the world that had failed her. The townsfolk, once content with their lives, now found themselves living in a shadow cast by the actions of one man whose name had become synonymous with terror. The police, initially skeptical of the young woman's claims, were soon forced to confront the evidence that pointed directly to Watts. The investigation that followed was a grueling process, a journey through the darkest corners of human nature, as the police pieced together the fragments of a life destroyed by a man who had no regard for the sanctity of human life. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The shallow grave, meticulously dug, revealed the remnants of a life that had been violently extinguished. The soil was disturbed, the grass around it trampled, and the presence of a makeshift shroud suggested a ritualistic act. The psychological evidence was even more disturbing. Watts had been a man of many faces, a charming individual who seemed to have everything going for him on the surface. Yet, beneath that veneer was a monster, a predator who preyed on the vulnerable, luring them into a false sense of security before meting out his brutal justice. The investigation led the police to Watts's home, a place that seemed to be a contradiction in terms, a sanctuary that harbored a killer. Inside, they found a collection of photographs that told a harrowing tale. There were images of Watts with his victims, smiling, posing, as if they were merely acquaintances rather than the victims of a twisted obsession. There were also letters, love notes, that spoke of a man in love, a man who claimed to have found his soulmate in each of his victims. The police were appalled by the audacity of Watts's lies, the ease with which he had manipulated and destroyed the lives of so many. As the investigation deepened, the police uncovered a pattern that chilled the very bones of those involved. Watts had been a serial killer, preying on women who were either alone or in vulnerable situations. He had used a variety of methods to lure his victims, from offering a ride home to promising love and companionship. Once they were in his grasp, he had used violence and manipulation to ensure their compliance before ultimately killing them. The police were faced with the daunting task of piecing together the lives of each of his victims, a task made more difficult by the fact that Watts had been meticulous in his planning, leaving few clues behind. The psychological evidence was equally harrowing. Watts had been a man who had no qualms about manipulating and lying, a man who seemed to thrive on the power he held over others. He had a history of domestic violence, a pattern of behavior that had been ignored or excused by those who knew him. His victims had all been women, many of them young and vulnerable, and the police were forced to confront the fact that Watts had been a predator who had been allowed to roam free for far too long. The investigation led the police to Watts's home, where they discovered a cache of weapons, including a hammer, a knife, and a taser, all of which had been used in his crimes. There were also items that suggested a ritualistic component to his killings, including a collection of candles, a set of tarot cards, and a journal filled with his thoughts and musings. The journal, in particular, was a chilling document, filled with the words of a man who seemed to revel in his power over others, a man who saw himself as a god, a being who could take life with the mere flick of a switch. The police were determined to bring Watts to justice, and as they continued their investigation, they discovered that he had been responsible for more than just the murders they were currently investigating. He had been a serial killer, a man who had been preying on women for years, a man who had been allowed to walk free, a man who had been a danger to society for far too long. The trial that followed was a spectacle, a trial that brought the community together in a way that had not been seen since the murders had begun. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including the physical evidence, the psychological evidence, and the testimonies of those who had known Watts, both before and after the murders. The defense, on the other hand, tried to paint Watts as a man who had been driven to madness by the women he had killed, a man who had been a victim himself. The jury, after hearing all the evidence, found Watts guilty of multiple counts of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The community, while relieved that justice had been served, was still reeling from the events that had unfolded. The lives of the victims had been senselessly taken, and the lives of their families and friends had been irrevocably altered. The shadow that had been cast over the town by Watts's actions would take years to fade, if it ever did. In the aftermath of the trial, the community came together to honor the memory of the victims, to remember the lives that had been lost, and to ensure that such a tragedy would never happen again. They erected a memorial, a place where people could come to reflect and to pay their respects. The memorial, a simple stone with the names of the victims etched into it, stood as a testament to the lives that had been stolen, a reminder of the darkness that had once lived among them. As the years passed, the community slowly began to heal, to move forward, but the scars left by Watts's actions would never fully heal. The memory of the murders would always be a part of them, a reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that can lurk within even the most seemingly ordinary individuals. The story of Christopher Lee Watts and the Watts family murders would be a cautionary tale, a story that would be told for generations, a story that would serve as a reminder of the importance of vigilance and the need to protect the vulnerable among us. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had left a trail of destruction in his wake, a trail that led to the discovery of his first victim's body in a shallow grave, her lifeless eyes staring back at the world that had failed her. The townsfolk, once content with their lives, now found themselves living in a shadow cast by the actions of one man whose name had become synonymous with terror. The police, initially skeptical of the young woman's claims, were soon forced to confront the evidence that pointed directly to Watts. The investigation that followed was a grueling process, a journey through the darkest corners of human nature, as the police pieced together the fragments of a life destroyed by a man who had no regard for the sanctity of human life. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The shallow grave, meticulously concealed beneath a tarpaulin, was discovered by a local dog walker who had noticed something amiss while taking his daily stroll. The body, decomposing but still recognizable, was that of a young woman who had vanished without a trace just days before. The police arrived on the scene, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they were dealing with a cold-blooded killer. They began their meticulous search, collecting soil samples and examining the surrounding area for any signs of struggle or disturbance. As they delved deeper into the investigation, the psychological evidence began to emerge. Watts, a seemingly ordinary man with a successful career and a seemingly happy family, had been leading a double life. He had been preying on young women, luring them with promises of romance, and then trapping them in a web of deceit and violence. The police discovered a series of journal entries that Watts had kept, detailing his thoughts and feelings about his victims. The entries were chilling, revealing a man who was both calculating and remorseless, a man who seemed to derive a sense of power from the fear and suffering he inflicted upon others. The journal entries also provided a timeline of Watts' crimes, leading the police to a series of locations where he had disposed of his victims. Each site was a grim reminder of the extent of his depravity. The police, working tirelessly, were able to piece together the story of Watts' rise and fall. They learned that he had been a serial killer for years, preying on women in his community and elsewhere. His victims ranged in age from teenagers to middle-aged women, all of whom had been lured to their deaths by the promise of love and companionship. As the investigation progressed, the police faced numerous challenges. They had to navigate the complexities of Watts' life, including his seemingly perfect family life, which was a stark contrast to the darkness he harbored within. They had to deal with the emotional toll of the case, as they uncovered the brutal truth about Watts' actions. They had to balance the need for justice with the desire to protect the public from a man who had shown no regard for human life. The psychological profile of Watts was as disturbing as the physical evidence. He had been a master manipulator, able to convince his victims that he was someone they could trust. He had been able to maintain his facade for years, even as he was committing heinous crimes. The police psychologist who evaluated Watts described him as a narcissist with a deep-seated need for control and power. He had a history of domestic violence, which had escalated over time, leading to the tragic deaths of his victims. The trial that followed was a spectacle, as the public learned the details of Watts' crimes. The courtroom was filled with the families of his victims, many of whom were seeking justice for their loved ones. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including the journal entries, DNA evidence, and witness testimony. The defense, however, tried to paint Watts as a victim of his own mental illness, arguing that he was not responsible for his actions. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury found Watts guilty of multiple counts of murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought a sense of closure to the families of the victims, but it did little to heal the wounds left by Watts' actions. The townsfolk, who had once known him as a neighbor and friend, now lived with the knowledge that they had been in the presence of a monster. The story of Christopher Lee Watts and the Watts family murders serves as a stark reminder of the darkness that can exist within the human soul. It is a story of betrayal, manipulation, and violence, a story that will be remembered for generations to come. The legacy of Watts is one of horror and despair, a legacy that will forever be etched into the fabric of the community he once called home. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had left a trail of destruction in his wake, a trail that led to the discovery of his first victim's body in a shallow grave, her lifeless eyes staring back at the world that had failed her. The townsfolk, once content with their lives, now found themselves living in a shadow cast by the actions of one man whose name had become synonymous with terror. The police, initially skeptical of the young woman's claims, were soon forced to confront the evidence that pointed directly to Watts. The investigation that followed was a grueling process, a journey through the darkest corners of human nature, as the police pieced together the fragments of a life destroyed by a man who had no regard for the sanctity of human life. The physical evidence was graphic and disturbing. Bloodstains marred the walls of Watts' home, and DNA tests confirmed that they matched the first victim. The psychological evidence was even more harrowing. Watts' own words, captured on tape, painted a picture of a monster who took pleasure in the suffering of others. He spoke of his victims with a cold detachment, describing their deaths as if they were nothing more than a means to an end. The police were shocked to learn that Watts had been a serial killer for years, preying on women who were vulnerable and alone. As the investigation deepened, the police uncovered a string of other victims. Each one had met a similar fate, their bodies found in remote locations, their lives cut short by a man who seemed to have an insatiable appetite for destruction. The psychological profile of Watts was chilling. He was a narcissist, a man who believed himself to be above the law and above the moral code that governed society. He saw his victims as pawns in a twisted game, and he reveled in the power he held over their lives. The townsfolk were in shock. They had known Watts as a seemingly normal man, a father and a husband, someone who seemed to have it all together. But as the evidence mounted, they realized that they had been living in denial, that they had failed to see the monster that had been lurking in their midst. The community was torn apart by the revelations, with some questioning their own judgment and others blaming the police for not taking the initial reports seriously. The police, however, were determined to bring Watts to justice. They worked tirelessly, combing through evidence, interviewing witnesses, and piecing together the puzzle of Watts' life. They discovered that he had been a former military man, someone who had been trained to handle stress and chaos. This knowledge helped them understand how he had been able to maintain such a facade while committing such heinous acts. The trial that followed was a spectacle. Watts was portrayed as a monster, a man who had no regard for human life. The courtroom was filled with the families of his victims, each one seeking justice for their loved ones. As the evidence was presented, the truth of Watts' actions became clear. He was a predator, a man who had chosen to live in the shadows, preying on the weak and the defenseless. The jury deliberated for days and eventually returned with a verdict of guilty on all counts. Watts was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The families of his victims were relieved, but they knew that nothing could bring their loved ones back. They had to find a way to move forward, to heal from the wounds that had been inflicted upon them. The trial brought the community together, though in a way that was painful and difficult. They had to confront the reality of what had been happening in their midst, and they had to come to terms with the fact that their lives would never be the same. The town of Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, had been forever changed by the actions of one man, a man who had shown the darkest side of human nature. As the years passed, the community slowly began to heal. They organized support groups for those affected by the tragedy, and they worked to ensure that such a thing could never happen again. They erected a memorial to the victims, a place where they could remember and honor those who had been lost. The town had been scarred, but it had also been strengthened by the resilience of its people. Christopher Lee Watts, the man who had once walked among them, was confined to a cell, a prisoner of his own making. His name would be remembered, not for the life he had lived, but for the lives he had taken. The legacy he left behind was one of horror and sadness, a reminder of the darkness that can exist within the human heart. But it was also a testament to the strength and courage of those who fought to bring him to justice and to rebuild their lives in the face of such tragedy. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had left a trail of destruction in his wake, a trail that led to the discovery of his first victim's body in a shallow grave, her lifeless eyes staring back at the world that had failed her. The townsfolk, once content with their lives, now found themselves living in a shadow cast by the actions of one man whose name had become synonymous with terror. The police, initially skeptical of the young woman's claims, were soon forced to confront the evidence that pointed directly to Watts. The investigation that followed was a grueling process, a journey through the darkest corners of human nature, as the police pieced together the fragments of a life destroyed by a man who had no regard for the sanctity of human life. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had been a man of many faces, a chameleon who could blend into any crowd, but now his true colors were exposed, and they were the darkest shades of evil. The forensic team worked tirelessly, examining every inch of the crime scene, searching for clues that might lead them to the answers they so desperately needed. They found DNA, blood spatter, and fibers that linked Watts to the young woman's murder. The psychological evidence was equally harrowing, revealing a man who had been manipulating and terrorizing his victims for years. Journal entries, love letters, and even social media posts painted a picture of a man who was capable of the most heinous acts. As the investigation deepened, more victims emerged. Each one had been lured by Watts's charm, deceived by his lies, and ultimately victimized by his greed and sadistic desires. The list of names grew longer, and so did the list of graves, each one a testament to Watts's callousness and the extent of his depravity. The police were determined to bring him to justice, but the trail was cold, and Watts seemed to always be one step ahead. In the midst of the chaos, a breakthrough came when a surviving victim, a woman who had narrowly escaped with her life, provided a crucial piece of information. She had seen Watts in the company of a young girl, a girl who had vanished without a trace. The police were immediately on the hunt, and their search led them to a remote cabin in the woods, a place where Watts had been hiding out, planning his next move. When the police arrived, Watts was nowhere to be found, but the cabin was filled with evidence of his recent presence. There were signs of a struggle, blood stains on the floor, and a MAKESHIFT Chinese letter where a victim had been held captive. The police worked tirelessly, combing through the cabin, searching for any sign of Watts. They were not disappointed, for in the depths of the cabin they found a hidden room, a room filled with the paraphernalia of a man who had no qualms about taking human life. The room was a shrine to Watts's dark side, a place where he had indulged in his twisted fantasies, a place where he had planned his next victims. Photos of his victims lined the walls, along with a collection of souvenirs, including jewelry and personal items that had been taken from them. The police were sickened by the evidence, but they were also driven by a burning desire to bring Watts to justice. Just as they were about to leave the cabin, they heard a noise. It was a faint whisper, a sound that made the hair on the back of their necks stand on end. They followed the sound to a small room in the basement, a room that had been hidden behind a false wall. Inside, they found Watts, crouched in a fetal position, his eyes wide with fear as he realized that his time was up. The police moved in, surrounding him, and Watts's world began to collapse around him. He was arrested, and his trial was a spectacle, a trial that would captivate the nation. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the psychological profiles painted a picture of a man who was beyond redemption. The jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison, a sentence that seemed more a formality than a punishment, given the nature of his crimes. The trial was over, but the impact of Watts's actions lingered on. The community was forever changed, scarred by the brutal acts of one man. The families of the victims found solace in the fact that justice had been served, but they also struggled with the knowledge that their loved ones would never return. The townsfolk continued to live in the shadow of Watts's crimes, a shadow that would never fully fade. The media, hungry for the next big story, quickly moved on to the next tragedy, but the police and the families of the victims remained vigilant, determined to prevent such acts from happening again. They knew that Watts was just the tip of the iceberg, that there were others out there just as dangerous, just as twisted. The fight against such darkness was never-ending, but it was a fight that they were willing to wage for the sake of the innocent lives that had been stolen. In the years that followed, the families of the victims continued to seek closure, to find ways to honor the memories of their loved ones. They formed support groups, they created foundations, and they lobbied for stricter laws and better resources for law enforcement. They knew that the legacy of Watts and his victims would never be forgotten, and that their fight against such darkness was one that they would carry on for as long as they lived. As the years passed, the stories of Watts and his victims faded from the headlines, but they remained etched in the hearts of those who had known them. The pain of their loss was a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the evil that can lurk in the hearts of men. And so, the story of Christopher Lee Watts, the man who had destroyed so many lives, would be remembered, not just for the horror of his crimes, but for the resilience of those who had survived and the courage of those who had fought to bring him to justice. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had left a trail of destruction in his wake, a trail that led to the discovery of his first victim's body in a shallow grave, her lifeless eyes staring back at the world that had failed her. The townsfolk, once content with their lives, now found themselves living in a shadow cast by the actions of one man whose name had become synonymous with terror. The police, initially skeptical of the young woman's claims, were soon forced to confront the evidence that pointed directly to Watts. The investigation that followed was a grueling process, a journey through the darkest corners of human nature, as the police pieced together the fragments of a life destroyed by a man who had no regard for the sanctity of human life. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had been a respected figure in the community, a father and a husband, but beneath the veneer of normalcy, a monster lurked. As the investigation deepened, the police uncovered a pattern of behavior that suggested Watts had been preying on vulnerable women for years. They discovered a series of anonymous letters, each one signed with a chilling moniker, the Prey Hunter. The letters contained detailed descriptions of his victims, their whereabouts, and even their darkest secrets. It was a twisted game of cat and mouse, with Watts as the cunning predator and his unsuspecting victims as his prey. The first break in the case came when a surviving victim, a woman who had narrowly escaped with her life, came forward. She described Watts as a charismatic and charming man who had wormed his way into her life, only to betray her trust and leave her shattered. The police, with the help of forensic experts, began to analyze the letters, searching for any trace of the killer's identity. They found a pattern in the language, a signature that seemed to suggest that Watts was a man who took great pride in his work. As the investigation continued, the police focused on Watts's social circle, looking for anyone who might have had a motive to harm him or who could provide insight into his mental state. They spoke with his friends, neighbors, and even his own family, all of whom expressed shock and disbelief at the allegations. Watts had seemed like a model citizen, a man who was deeply invested in his community and his family. But as the evidence mounted, the picture that emerged was one of a man who was both cunning and manipulative. Watts had been using his charm and charisma to lure women into his home, where he would hold them captive, torturing them both physically and mentally. The police discovered a series of videotapes that showed Watts confessing to his crimes, detailing the methods he used to trap and kill his victims. The videos were graphic and disturbing, a testament to the depravity that lay beneath the surface of the man who had once been a respected member of society. The trial that followed was a spectacle, with the media circus surrounding the courtroom as the world watched in horror. Watts stood trial for the murders of his first two victims, but the evidence suggested that he had a long history of violence and that many more lives had been lost to his hands. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including the letters, the videos, and the testimony of the surviving victims. The defense, however, tried to paint Watts as the victim of mental illness, a man who had been driven to kill by an incurable disease. The jury, after days of deliberation, found Watts guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict was a relief to the townsfolk, who had been living in constant fear since the murders began. But the weight of the loss was heavy, and the scars left by Watts's actions would take years to heal. As Watts was led away to his cell, the townsfolk breathed a sigh of relief. But the shadow that had been cast over their community would not be so easily erased. The memory of Watts's crimes would linger, a stark reminder of the darkness that can exist within even the most seemingly normal of people. The police, though, remained vigilant, determined to prevent such tragedies from happening again. They knew that the work of bringing Watts to justice was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey to restore peace and safety to their community. Had left a trail of destruction in his wake, a trail that led to the discovery of his first victim's body in a shallow grave, her lifeless eyes staring back at the world that had failed her. The townsfolk, once content with their lives, now found themselves living in a shadow cast by the actions of one man whose name had become synonymous with terror. The police, initially skeptical of the young woman's claims, were soon forced to confront the evidence that pointed directly to Watts. The investigation that followed was a grueling process, a journey through the darkest corners of human nature, as the police pieced together the fragments of a life destroyed by a man who had no regard for the sanctity of human life. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had been meticulous in his planning, a characteristic that only added to the horror of his crimes. He had chosen his victims carefully, selecting those who were least likely to be missed, and he had used his charm to lure them into his deadly trap. His victims ranged from young mothers to elderly widows, each one falling prey to his cunning manipulation and terrifying strength. The police were shocked to find that Watts had been living under their noses, blending seamlessly into the community, his true nature hidden beneath a veneer of respectability. As the investigation progressed, the police uncovered a web of deceit and manipulation that seemed to have no end. Watts had a talent for controlling people, using fear and guilt to keep them silent. He had even convinced some of his victims to help him dispose of the bodies, ensuring that the trail would lead nowhere. The psychological profiling that the police conducted revealed a mind twisted by obsession and a desire for power, a man who saw himself as the puppeteer controlling the strings of the lives around him. The first break in the case came when a young woman reported that she had seen Watts with a body in the trunk of his car. This led to a massive manhunt, with law enforcement agencies across the state mobilizing to find the serial killer. The pressure was immense, and the police were determined not to fail the families of the victims. They worked around the clock, reviewing security footage, questioning witnesses, and combing through the evidence that Watts had left behind. In the end, it was a small piece of physical evidence that cracked the case wide open. A hair sample found on the body of one of the victims matched Watts's DNA, a match that could not be explained by any other means. With this crucial piece of evidence, the police had no choice but to arrest him. Watts was taken into custody, and the townsfolk of Cuyahoga Falls breathed a collective sigh of relief. The trial that followed was a spectacle, a battle of wills between the prosecution and the defense. Watts's attorney argued that his client was a victim of his own mental illness, that he was not responsible for his actions. However, the mountain of evidence presented by the prosecution, including the chilling details of his crimes and the psychological profiles that painted him as a cold-blooded killer, was too overwhelming. The jury found Watts guilty of multiple counts of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Watts family murders left a lasting scar on the community of Cuyahoga Falls. The once peaceful town was forever changed by the actions of one man, a man whose name would be etched into the annals of history as a symbol of the darkest depths of human nature. The families of the victims sought solace in the fact that justice had been served, but they could never forget the lives lost and the pain that would linger with them for the rest of their days. As the years passed, the story of Christopher Lee Watts continued to be a topic of conversation, a reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that can reside in the hearts of men. The police, who had tirelessly worked to bring him to justice, found themselves haunted by the knowledge that there were others out there, still free, who could bring about similar destruction. They vowed to stay vigilant, to protect their community from the shadows that could once again threaten the safety and well-being of innocent lives. The legacy of Christopher Lee Watts would not be forgotten. His crimes would serve as a stark warning to society about the dangers that lurk within, a reminder that even in the most seemingly idyllic of settings, darkness can find a way to seep in. And so, the story of Watts would continue to be told, a cautionary tale that would be shared for generations, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable horror. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had left a trail of destruction in his wake, a trail that led to the discovery of his first victim's body in a shallow grave, her lifeless eyes staring back at the world that had failed her. The townsfolk, once content with their lives, now found themselves living in a shadow cast by the actions of one man whose name had become synonymous with terror. The police, initially skeptical of the young woman's claims, were soon forced to confront the evidence that pointed directly to Watts. The investigation that followed was a grueling process, a journey through the darkest corners of human nature, as the police pieced together the fragments of a life destroyed by a man who had no regard for the sanctity of human life. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had a history of manipulation and deceit, a pattern that seemed to be unraveling as the pieces of his twisted past began to surface. The police discovered that Watts had been leading a double life, a life of charm and allure on the surface, while his true nature was a malevolent force that preyed on the innocence of others. He had a talent for creating an illusion of normalcy, which only made his victims more vulnerable. As the investigation deepened, the police uncovered a string of missing persons, each one more tragic than the last, each one a testament to Watts's callousness and control. Interviews with those who had known Watts painted a picture of a man who was charismatic and enigmatic, yet also secretive and suspicious. Friends and family described a man who could be caring and compassionate one moment, and then cruel and violent the next. It was this dichotomy that made Watts so dangerous, as it allowed him to maintain his facade while preying on the most vulnerable members of society. The psychological evidence was as chilling as the physical. Watts's behavior was indicative of a psychopath, a man who had no empathy for others and who thrived on the thrill of power and control. He had a disturbing ability to manipulate and exploit his victims, leaving them with no hope and no way out. The psychological profiling revealed that Watts had a deep-seated need for dominance, a need that drove him to commit heinous acts. As the investigation continued, the police discovered that Watts had been a serial killer, a man who had been preying on women for years. They found a pattern in his victims, young, vulnerable, and often unsuspecting. Watts had a method to his madness, a method that allowed him to pick his targets with ease. He would gain their trust, charm them, and then isolate them, ensuring that they had no one to turn to for help. The physical evidence was equally harrowing. The bodies of his victims were discovered in various states of decay, some buried in shallow graves, others left in abandoned vehicles. Watts had no remorse for his actions, no sense of guilt or regret. He had become a monster, a creature of darkness that lurked in the shadows, waiting for his next victim. The police, determined to bring Watts to justice, followed the trail of evidence that led them to a secluded cabin deep in the woods. Inside, they found a scene of horror. The cabin was filled with the stench of decay, and the walls were covered in disturbing graffiti that spoke of Watts's twisted mindset. It was in this cabin that the police finally caught Watts, a man who had been a ghostly presence in the lives of so many. The trial that followed was a roller coaster of emotions, as the jury was forced to confront the cold, calculating nature of Watts. His attorneys tried to portray him as a misunderstood individual, but the evidence was overwhelming. The victims' families watched in horror as their loved ones were brought into the courtroom, their faces etched with pain and sorrow. Watts showed no remorse, no empathy, as he was sentenced to multiple life sentences, a fate that seemed fitting for a man who had shown no regard for human life. The story of Christopher Lee Watts and the Watts family murders serves as a stark reminder of the darkness that can exist within the human soul. It is a tale of greed, manipulation, and a complete lack of empathy, a story that will forever be etched in the minds of those who were affected by his monstrous acts. As the town of Cuyahoga Falls began to heal from the wounds inflicted by Watts, it did so with a newfound vigilance, a determination to never allow such a tragedy to occur again. The legacy of Christopher Lee Watts will forever be one of horror, a chilling testament to the worst of human nature. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had left a trail of destruction in his wake, a trail that led to the discovery of his first victim's body in a shallow grave, her lifeless eyes staring back at the world that had failed her. The townsfolk, once content with their lives, now found themselves living in a shadow cast by the actions of one man whose name had become synonymous with terror. The police, initially skeptical of the young woman's claims, were soon forced to confront the evidence that pointed directly to Watts. The investigation that followed was a grueling process, a journey through the darkest corners of human nature, as the police pieced together the fragments of a life destroyed by a man who had no regard for the sanctity of human life. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had a knack for evading suspicion, a skill that would soon be put to the test as the investigation deepened. The police had to delve into Watts' background, examining his history of domestic violence and his fascination with the occult. They uncovered a pattern of behavior that suggested he had been preying on women for years, using his charm and manipulative tactics to lure them into his web of deceit. First victim, a young mother named Tessa, had been reported missing after a night out with friends. It wasn't until her car was found abandoned near Watts' home that the police began to suspect the worst. As they sifted through the evidence, they discovered a series of text messages between Watts and Tessa that revealed his sinister intentions. He had been grooming her for months, feeding her a steady diet of lies and manipulation. The messages were graphic, detailing his plans to kidnap and murder her. The police were stunned by the extent of his depravity, but they were determined to bring him to justice. Watts' home was a virtual treasure trove of evidence. The police found a collection of women's clothing, jewelry, and personal items that suggested he had been storing the remains of his victims. They also discovered a makeshift altar in his bedroom, adorned with occult symbols and photographs of women he had claimed to have saved from evil. The police were left to wonder what kind of twisted logic could lead a man to commit such heinous acts. As the investigation progressed, more victims emerged. Each one had been lured by Watts' promises of love and protection, only to be subjected to unimaginable horror. The police were faced with the daunting task of piecing together the puzzle of Watts' victims, a task made even more difficult by the fact that many of them had been strangled to death, leaving little to no DNA evidence behind. The psychological profile of Watts was equally disturbing. He was a narcissist with a deep-seated need for control and power. He saw himself as a savior, a man chosen to cleanse the world of evil. His victims, he believed, were simply obstacles to be removed. The police were haunted by the thought of how many more lives Watts might have taken if they had not intervened. The trial was a spectacle, a battle of wits between the prosecution and the defense. The defense attorney, a seasoned trial lawyer, attempted to paint Watts as a victim of his own circumstances, a man who had been driven to madness by a world that had rejected him. The prosecution, however, had an overwhelming amount of evidence against him, including the testimonies of several women who had narrowly escaped his grasp. As the trial unfolded, the jury was faced with a difficult decision. Could they believe the chilling testimony of the survivors and the overwhelming evidence against Watts? Or were they swayed by the defense's attempt to portray him as a misunderstood individual? In the end, the jury found Watts guilty on all counts, delivering a verdict that would send him to prison for the rest of his life. The sentencing was a somber affair, a ceremony that marked the end of Watts' reign of terror. The townsfolk who had once lived in fear now felt a sense of relief. They had seen justice served, and they were determined to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of the tragedy. But the scars left by Watts would never fully heal, and the memory of his victims would forever be etched into the hearts of those who had known them. The case of Christopher Lee Watts was a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk within the human soul. It was a story that would be told for generations, a cautionary tale of the dangers of trust and the consequences of evil. And while the justice system had done its duty, the pain and suffering of Watts' victims would never be forgotten. For in the end, it was the resilience of the human spirit that had triumphed over the darkness, a testament to the enduring power of hope and love. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had left a trail of destruction in his wake, a trail that led to the discovery of his first victim's body in a shallow grave, her lifeless eyes staring back at the world that had failed her. The townsfolk, once content with their lives, now found themselves living in a shadow cast by the actions of one man whose name had become synonymous with terror. The police, initially skeptical of the young woman's claims, were soon forced to confront the evidence that pointed directly to Watts. The investigation that followed was a grueling process, a journey through the darkest corners of human nature, as the police pieced together the fragments of a life destroyed by a man who had no regard for the sanctity of human life. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had a method to his madness, a ritualistic approach that left no room for doubt. He would lure his victims with promises of love and affection, only to betray them with a knife or a rope, depending on his whims. As the investigation deepened, the police uncovered a web of deceit and manipulation that Watts had woven around himself. He was a master of disguise, able to blend into any community, any social circle, and yet he was also a predator, always on the prowl for his next victim. His victims were often young and vulnerable, women who trusted him with their lives, never suspecting that the man they loved was a monster in human form. The psychological evidence was as disturbing as the physical. Watts had a history of violence, a history that his wife and children were all too aware of. Yet they remained silent, bound by fear and a desperate need to protect their family from the outside world. The police discovered that Watts had been abusing his wife for years, a pattern of behavior that had only intensified as his obsession with power and control grew. The physical evidence was equally harrowing. The police found a cache of weapons in Watts's home, including a set of surgical tools that suggested he had been preparing for his next act. They also discovered a collection of photographs and videos that depicted Watts in various stages of his crimes, from the moment he lured his victims to the moment he disposed of their bodies. The details were graphic, the images haunting, and yet they were crucial to the investigation, providing the police with the evidence they needed to build a case against the man who had become a symbol of evil. As the trial approached, the community was on edge. They had seen the evidence, They had heard the details of Watts's crimes, and yet they couldn't help but wonder if justice would truly be served. The defense team, led by a charismatic lawyer, argued that Watts was a product of his environment, a man who had been raised in an abusive household and had never learned how to express his emotions in a healthy way. The prosecution, however, painted a picture of a man who was cunning and calculating, a man who chose his victims carefully and who had no remorse for the pain and suffering he caused. The trial was a spectacle, a battle of wits and wills between the prosecution and the defense. The jury was sequestered, isolated from the outside world, as they grappled with the gravity of the charges against Watts. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies of the victims' families were heart-wrenching, and yet the defense managed to plant seeds of doubt in the jury's minds. In the end, it was a hung jury, a result that left the community in shock and the police frustrated. The appeals process was lengthy and complex, but eventually, Watts was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The community breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the scars left by Watts's actions would take generations to heal. The townsfolk had to rebuild their lives, to find a way to move forward in the face of such horror. They had to learn to trust again, to believe that there were still good people in the world, that justice could indeed be served. As the years passed, the story of Christopher Lee Watts faded from the headlines, but the memories of his victims remained etched in the hearts of those who had known them. The police, who had worked tirelessly to bring Watts to justice, continued their efforts to solve other cold cases, to bring closure to families who had lost loved ones to similar acts of violence. And though the world moved on, the legacy of Christopher Lee Watts would forever be a stark reminder of the depths to which a human being can sink when driven by a twisted sense of power and control. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had left a trail of destruction in his wake, a trail that led to the discovery of his first victim's body in a shallow grave, her lifeless eyes staring back at the world that had failed her. The townsfolk, once content with their lives, now found themselves living in a shadow cast by the actions of one man whose name had become synonymous with terror. The police, initially skeptical of the young woman's claims, were soon forced to confront the evidence that pointed directly to Watts. The investigation that followed was a grueling process, a journey through the darkest corners of human nature, as the police pieced together the fragments of a life destroyed by a man who had no regard for the sanctity of human life. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Fingerprints, DNA, and forensic tests confirmed that Watts was the perpetrator. The psychological evidence was equally disturbing, revealing a man who was a master manipulator, capable of convincing even the most skeptical that his lies were the truth. His victims, young and vulnerable, had trusted him, had seen him as a friend, a confidant, a savior. But in reality, they were falling into a web of deceit and despair that Watts had spun with meticulous care. As the investigation deepened, the police uncovered a pattern of behavior that was eerily consistent. Watts had a history of dating young women, often those who were vulnerable or in need of a helping hand. He would shower them with affection, offering support and companionship, all the while plotting his next move. He would isolate his victims, ensuring they had no one to turn to for help. Then, when the time was right, he would strike, often killing them and disposing of their bodies in remote locations. The psychological profile painted a picture of a man who was both calculating and cunning. Watts had a narcissistic personality disorder, a condition that allowed him to manipulate and control others with ease. He was also a sociopath, lacking in empathy and remorse. The combination of these disorders made him a dangerous predator, one who could not be trusted or predicted. As the investigation progressed, the police began to connect the dots. They discovered that Watts had been involved in multiple missing persons cases, and they realized that some of these individuals had not simply vanished but had met a tragic end. The scale of his crimes was staggering, and the community was left reeling. How could someone they had known, someone who had seemed so normal, have been capable of such heinous acts? The interviews with Watts's victims' families were heart-wrenching. They spoke of their loss, of the pain and the grief that had consumed them since their loved ones had disappeared. The police, determined to bring justice to the victims, worked tirelessly, piecing together the puzzle of Watts's life and crimes. The trial that followed was a roller coaster of emotions. Watts's defense team tried to paint him as a misunderstood individual, a man who had been pushed to the brink by a society that had failed him. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, and the jury saw through the lies. Watts was found guilty on multiple counts of murder, and the community breathed a collective sigh of relief. The sentencing was a solemn affair. Watts was sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. The judge, in delivering the sentence, made it clear that Watts's actions were inexcusable, that he had shown no remorse, and that he posed a danger to society. The victims' families were present, and while they were not satisfied with the sentence, they knew that Watts would never be free to harm anyone else. The aftermath of the Watts family murders was one of healing and rebuilding. The community, once shattered by the loss of their loved ones, began to come together, supporting each other through the pain. They formed support groups, created memorials, and worked to ensure that such a tragedy would never happen again. The story of Christopher Lee Watts served as a stark reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows, a warning that even those who seem most normal can be capable of the most heinous acts. As time passed, the memories of the Watts family murders began to fade, but the lessons learned from the tragedy remained. The community, now more vigilant and aware, worked to create a safer environment for their children and families. The police, too, were more cautious, knowing that the dangers they faced were not always visible on the surface. And for those who had lost their loved ones to Watts, the pain never truly went away, but they found solace in knowing that justice had been served, and that their loved ones' deaths had not been in vain. The legacy of Christopher Lee Watts would be one of horror and sadness, a story that would be told for generations as a cautionary tale of the darkness that can exist within the human soul. And while the world would never forget the pain and suffering caused by Watts, it would also remember the resilience of the community that stood strong in the face of such a monstrous act. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had left a trail of destruction in his wake, a trail that led to the discovery of his first victim's body in a shallow grave, her lifeless eyes staring back at the world that had failed her. The townsfolk, once content with their lives, now found themselves living in a shadow cast by the actions of one man whose name had become synonymous with terror. The police, initially skeptical of the young woman's claims, were soon forced to confront the evidence that pointed directly to Watts. The investigation that followed was a grueling process, a journey through the darkest corners of human nature, as the police pieced together the fragments of a life destroyed by a man who had no regard for the sanctity of human life. The evidence, both physical and psychological, was chilling. Watts had been a man of many faces, a chameleon who could blend into any environment, but now his true colors were exposed for all to see. As the investigation deepened, more victims emerged from the shadows, their stories a haunting echo of the horror that had been unleashed upon their lives. Each one had met with Watts, a man who had promised them love and protection, only to shackle them in a living hell from which there was no escape. The police, driven by a sense of duty and justice, worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, to bring Watts to his knees and to offer solace to the families who had lost so much. The physical evidence was stark and brutal. Blood-stained clothing, DNA samples, and forensic analysis all pointed to Watts as the perpetrator. But it was the psychological evidence that was perhaps the most chilling of all. Letters, messages, and even social media posts painted a picture of a man who was both charming and manipulative, capable of turning a smile into a mask of deceit. The police were left with a daunting task: to understand the mind of a monster, to uncover the secrets that lay hidden beneath the surface of a seemingly normal man. As the investigation progressed, the police faced a myriad of challenges. They had to navigate through a complex web of lies and deceit to separate fact from fiction. They had to rely on the memories of the victims and the testimonies of those who had known Watts to piece together the puzzle of his twisted psyche. And all the while, they had to protect themselves from the darkness that seemed to permeate every aspect of the case. The families of the victims, torn apart by grief and shock, were desperate for answers. They wanted to know how their loved ones had ended up in such a tragic fate, and they wanted justice. The police, aware of the weight of their responsibility, worked tirelessly to provide closure, to ensure that the victims' stories would not be forgotten. The trial that followed was a spectacle, a courtroom drama that captivated the nation. The defense attempted to paint Watts as a victim himself, a man who had been pushed to the brink by a world that had wronged him. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury saw through the facade. Watts was found guilty, and the sentence handed down was one that echoed through the halls of justice, a sentence that served as a stark reminder of the consequences of evil. In the aftermath of the trial, the community began to heal, but the scars of the past remained. The townsfolk, once bound by the bonds of friendship and neighborly respect, found themselves divided. Some saw Watts as a monster, a man who had violated the very essence of what it meant to be human. Others, however, felt empathy for a man who had been so thoroughly corrupted by his own desires. The media, always hungry for a story, continued to hound the families and the community, their relentless pursuit of the sensational often overshadowing the need for healing and understanding. The police, though weary from the grueling investigation and trial, remained committed to their mission, determined to ensure that the victims would never be forgotten. And so, the story of Christopher Lee Watts continued to unfold, a tale of darkness and light, of the strength of the human spirit and the depths of human despair. It served as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that the line between good and evil is often blurred, and that the monsters among us can walk among us undetected until their true nature is exposed.